The blizzard came without warning that December, burying the edge of town under 2 feet of silence. Amelia Vaughn stood in front of the old garage at the end of Rutherford Lane and laughed, not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from a woman who has never been told she is wrong. She was 35 years old, the CEO of Vaughn Autotech, and she had not laughed genuinely in months. This was the closest thing. Contempt dressed up as amusement. The building in front of her was a disaster. Paint peeled in long gray strips from the exterior walls. The roof sagged at the eastern corner, where a pine branch had fallen 2 winters ago, and nobody had bothered to remove it. 3 of the 8 windows were boarded up with plywood that had since warped and blackened. Snow gathered in the grooves where the old lettering used to be the name of something that no longer mattered. A business that had outlived its purpose. Her assistant, Daniel, stood beside her with a clipboard pressed to his chest, waiting. He had learned never to speak until spoken to, especially in weather like this, when Amelia's mood was as cold as the temperature and twice as unpredictable. Amelia pulled her coat tighter and turned away from the building. She had inherited the garage 3 years ago when her father passed, along with the company, along with the debt, along with the complicated grief that she had never properly processed and never planned to. The garage had been his pet project, his private kingdom, the place he disappeared to on weekends when she was a child. Back then she had resented it. Now she simply wanted it gone. It was an asset, on paper, a liability in practice, and her accountants had been circling it for 2 quarters, with red ink and impatient annotations. The plan was clean. Sell the property before year-end. Clear the balance sheet. Move forward. That was how Amelia operated. Forward, always forward. She did not look back, because looking back required feeling things, and feeling things took time she did not have. The garage had been on the market for 60 days. No serious buyers. A stroke that came fast and left nothing unfinished, because his father had never been the kind of man who left things unfinished. Jack had come home for the funeral, looked at the garage, and stayed. The degree got framed and went on the office wall beside a photograph of his father and a calendar from an auto parts supplier. And some months, the calendar was the most current thing in the room. His wife, Dana, had left 6 years ago. There was no dramatic scene, no screaming or throwing of dishes. She had simply packed 2 bags on a Tuesday afternoon while their daughter, Lily, was at school, set her wedding ring on the kitchen counter with a quietness that was somehow worse than any argument, and driven away in a direction that was not back. Jack had not heard from her since, which he told people was fine. Which was not fine at all, but had become familiar enough to pass for fine on most days. He raised Lily alone, picked her up from school, made her grilled cheese and tomato soup, attended her school plays in the front row, with his phone camera tilted at the wrong angle, and went back to the garage every morning before the sun was fully up. He was good at the work, genuinely, almost brilliantly good, and in a different life, that talent would have meant something measurable. In this life, it meant he could diagnose a carburetor problem by sound, which was impressive at a local level, and largely invisible to the rest of the world. People brought him their trucks and their motorcycles and their lawn equipment, and he fixed what was brought to him. And he charged what he thought was fair, and he went home each evening with clean hands and a quietness that filled the house in ways he didn't always know how to address. The garage itself was called Turner's Auto and Cycle, a name painted in fading blue letters above the bay doors, the paint peeling at the edges in long, thin strips like sunburned skin. The building had been his father's before it was his, which gave it a kind of inherited dignity that the bank did not seem moved by. The loan on the property was 4 months behind. Jack had called twice to explain, had been patient and articulate, had offered smaller payments and longer timelines, and had been told in return that the matter was being escalated to the appropriate department. He understood what that meant. He had 30 days, maybe 40, before the appropriate department did something he would not be able to undo. On the night the rain came, a Thursday, in late October, the kind of cold that gets inside your collar and stays, Jack was alone in the garage, running a diagnostic on a pickup truck he'd agreed to look at for half the usual rate, because the owner was old Mrs. Patterson, and she'd known his father, and he couldn't bring himself to charge her full price. He had sent Lily to sleep over at her friend Clara's house because the forecast was bad and the drive home from school the next day worried him. He'd eaten a sandwich standing up, watched the rain start as a drizzle and then become something more serious, and had begun genuinely considering calling it a night when the lights in the garage flickered, went out completely for 4 seconds, and came back. He looked out the window. The street was empty. The whole town felt emptied out, like someone had lifted Millhaven up and shaken it, and all the people had rolled to the edges. He switched off the work lights over Mrs. Patterson's truck, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and was reaching for his jacket when he saw the headlights. They came slowly, wavering, the beams catching the rain at odd angles so that the falling water looked almost solid, like something you could lean on. There were 4 motorcycles, big ones, touring bikes that were built for long roads and bad weather but were not built to run without functioning engines, and all 4 were being pushed by hand. The riders were leaning hard into the effort, boots scraping the wet asphalt, shoulders hunched against the rain. Jack watched them come for a moment, 5 people in all. The 4 pushing and 1 walking alongside with a slight limp, one hand pressed to his left side like he was holding something in place. They stopped at the edge of the parking lot, and one of them called out over the rain, a voice big enough to carry. He asked if the garage was open. Jack looked at his jacket in his hand. He looked at the clock on the wall. He looked back at the 5 people standing in the rain. He hung the jacket back on its hook, walked to the bay door, and rolled it open. They came inside, dripping, trailing pools of rainwater across the concrete floor, and in the fluorescent light of the garage they looked even wetter than they had in the dark, which Jack had not thought was possible. They were older than he expected, mid-40s to late 60s. Rough in the way that people get rough from years of physical work rather than from trying to look tough. Their jackets were leather and canvas, worn to softness, decorated with patches that Jack didn't try to read. One of the women, a broad-shouldered person with cropped gray hair and a no-nonsense expression, was already crouching beside the closest bike, looking at the engine with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was looking for, even if she couldn't fix it herself. The man with the limp sat down heavily on the metal folding chair Jack kept near the office door, the one he'd had since his father's time, and pressed his hand more firmly to his left side. He was the oldest of the group by at least 15 years, with white hair cut close to his head and a face that was lined but not unkind, the face of someone who had made most of his decisions a long time ago and had mostly made peace with them. Jack asked if he was hurt. The man said it was an old injury, nothing serious, just a rib that didn't like cold weather or long rides. He said it with a dismissiveness that suggested he'd been saying it for years. The group had tried 2 other garages before Turner's. At Rite Aid's, the first had turned off its lights before they could knock. The second had a night attendant who came to the door, looked them over carefully, and said the equipment wasn't available. Jack did not say anything about this. He walked to the small electric kettle he kept on the shelf above the parts bin, filled it from the tap in the utility sink, and switched it on. He pulled 4 mismatched mugs from the cabinet, a box of instant coffee, and a half-empty canister of sugar. He found a stack of clean shop towels, not paper towels, actual cloth towels, rough but dry, and set them on the workbench within reach. He handed 1 to the man with the bad rib and 2 to the woman with the gray hair, without making a production of it, without waiting to be thanked. Then he walked to the first motorcycle and started looking. He asked what had happened. The gray-haired woman, her name was Ellen, she said, though she didn't offer a last name, explained that they'd been riding since morning, had hit the rain about 40 miles out, and had pulled off once already to wait it out. On the way back to the road, 2 of the bikes had started cutting out, then a third. She described the symptoms in good technical language, better than most of his regular customers managed, and Jack listened without interrupting, crouching beside the engine to look where she pointed. The 4th bike had been making a sound for about 100 miles that the owner, a quiet, watchful man named Davis, who had not yet said more than 3 words, described as a grinding that went away when you held a certain RPM. Jack nodded. He asked if anyone wanted their coffee now or after. Davis said after. Everyone else said now. He worked the way he always worked, which was steadily and without wasted motion, pausing to think only when the problem required thinking rather than doing. The garage filled with the small sounds of work, the click of a ratchet, the soft hiss of a diagnostic tool, the low voice of Ellen asking occasional questions that Jack answered without looking up. Outside, the rain continued its conversation with the roof, shifting from a hammering to a steady pour and back again, the way long storms had their own internal rhythms. The rest of the group settled into the space, the way travelers settle into unexpected shelter gratefully, tentatively, then with increasing ease. Davis found a stack of old trade magazines on the shelf beside the parts bin and flipped through them slowly. The fifth member of the group, a woman named Carol, who had been the quietest of all of them, short and watchful with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, produced a small paperback from an inside jacket pocket and read by the light of her phone. The kettle was refilled twice. Jack kept working. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had gotten heavier, and when lightning struck close enough to shake the building, the lights went out entirely for almost 30 seconds. Jack reached for the flashlight he kept clipped to the side of the rolling tool chest without missing a beat, switched it on, and kept working. Someone in the group said something low and impressed. He didn't catch the exact words. The man with the bad rib, whose name was Walter, offered without fanfare, as he accepted a second cup of coffee, had moved his folding chair closer to where Jack was working, and was watching with a quality of attention that felt different from casual curiosity. He asked Jack how long he'd been doing this. Jack said since he was 9 years old, working beside his father. Walter asked if he'd always been in Millhaven. Jack said mostly. Walter asked what the mostly meant, and Jack, who was focused on a corroded fuel line and not really thinking about the question as a question, told the truth. He said he'd gone away for school, gotten a degree in mechanical engineering from a state university 4 hours north, had an offer from a manufacturing firm in Cincinnati that would have been a real career, the kind with a salary and a trajectory and a retirement account. Walter asked what happened. Jack said life happened. He didn't elaborate and Walter didn't push, but he kept watching. And when Jack glanced up, something in the older man's expression was careful in a way that was hard to read in the unsteady light of the flashlight. The power came back twice more, and went out twice more before 2 in the morning. By that point, Jack had cleared the fuel line on the first bike, replaced a failing ignition module on the second, using a part he'd pulled from his salvage rack in the back corner, cleaned and reset the carburetor on the third, and was halfway through diagnosing the grinding issue on Davis's machine. Davis himself had moved from standing to sitting on an overturned bucket, watching Jack work with an expression that had shifted from wary to openly respectful over the course of the evening. At one point he got up without being asked and held the flashlight steady while Jack needed 2 hands in a tight space. And Jack thanked him, and Davis said it was nothing, and neither of them made more of it than that. Around 3 in the morning, when the worst of the storm had passed and become merely a heavy, steady rain, Ellen said, "You're doing all this for what, $100? Jack said he'd quoted them 80 for the first 2 bikes, 40 for each of the others. Ellen looked at Walter. Walter looked at Jack. He asked the question directly, in a way that wasn't challenging but wasn't casual either. He asked why Jack would help strangers for almost nothing, in the middle of the night, when nobody would have blamed him for locking the door. Jack set down the socket wrench he'd been holding and thought about it for a moment, not performing the thinking, actually doing it. Then he said, "Because someone should." He picked the wrench back up. Walter was quiet for a long time after that. Davis's bike turned out to have a misaligned primary chain tensioner, which was fixable but required careful work in a tight area of the engine casing. Jack finished it just after 4:30 in the morning. He tested all 4 bikes, started them in sequence, listened to each one, made 2 small final adjustments on the third bike's idle, and declared them road-ready. The group paid him the quoted amount, which was less than the job was worth by a significant margin, and did not try to negotiate it higher when he didn't ask them to. They gathered their things slowly. The kind of slow that comes from tired bodies and something harder to name. Jack rolled the bay door back up and stood in the opening while they suited up. Walter was the last one ready. He stood beside his bike and looked at Jack for a moment, with that same careful expression, and then he said, "You have no idea who you helped tonight." He said it quietly enough that the others might not have heard. Then he put on his helmet, started the engine, and they rode out into the gray, thinning dark before dawn. Jack locked the bay door, walked into his small office, sat down in his chair, put his head back against the wall, and was asleep within 4 minutes. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember it. What pulled him out of sleep was not an alarm or a phone or Lily's voice, but a sound he recognized, even half awake, the sound of expensive engines. Not loud, not aggressive. The particular smooth restraint of well-engineered vehicles driven by people who had no need to prove anything. He opened his eyes to light that was wrong, too bright. Morning light instead of the pre-dawn dark he'd fallen asleep in. He sat up, winced at the crick in his neck, and looked out the smeared office window. There were 4 black SUVs in his parking lot, arranged with a precision that suggested someone had thought about it. They were the kind of vehicles that had no visible manufacturer's logo from the outside, which was itself a kind of statement. 3 of them had already stopped. The 4th was pulling in slowly from the road. Jack became aware, in a dim morning brain way, that there were people on the sidewalk outside Mrs. Holloway from the diner across the street. 2 teenagers on bikes who had stopped pedaling. A man he didn't recognize, standing with his hands in his pockets. Word traveled fast in Millhaven, even before 7 in the morning. The SUV's doors opened with that soft, decisive sound of heavy doors on good hinges. The people who stepped out were wearing dark clothing, some in suits, some in more practical gear, all of them with the bearing of people who were there because they were supposed to be there and not for any other reason. Jack stood up from his office chair. He was still wearing yesterday's clothes, oil-stained at the cuffs and the knees, his hair pressed flat on one side from the wall. He looked at the small window again and felt a slow, cold clarity replace the last of the sleep. He thought, "I haven't done anything wrong." He thought, "That's probably what everyone thinks." He walked to the door of his office and opened it. The morning air was cold and smelled like rain-washed concrete and early autumn, and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. He would realize later it was the smell of money, which is a real smell, the smell of leather interiors and quality fabric and whatever compound they put in the air of buildings that cost a great deal to maintain. He stood in the doorway of his garage and looked at the people in his parking lot, and they looked back at him. And then the door of the center SUV opened, and the man who stepped out was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Jack's monthly mortgage payment. And his white hair was cut close to his head, and he had a slight press of his left hand against his ribs as he straightened up. It was Walter. Jack did not move for a moment. His brain ran the comparison, automatically the soaking wet man in the leather jacket, who had sat in the metal folding chair drinking instant coffee at 2 in the morning against the figure crossing the parking lot now in the early morning light, unhurried, flanked, without being crowded by 2 people who were very clearly not assistants in any casual sense. The suit was different. The posture was the same. The expression was the same. Careful, watching, reading. Jack looked at the parking lot, at the SUVs, at the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, and then back at Walter. He said, "Your rib doing okay?" And Walter stopped walking and laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, and said yes. It was managing. Walter's full name was Raymond Hale. Jack knew the name. Anyone who had ever worked on a motorcycle, who had read the trade publications, who had followed the industry at any level, knew the name. Raymond Hale had started a motorcycle company out of a rented warehouse in Tennessee 31 years ago with a business partner who later bought him out in what the industry press had called amicable and insiders knew was anything but. He had started over, rebuilt, made decisions that people thought were wrong and that turned out to be either ahead of their time or exactly right for their time, and had grown Hale Motor Group into a company that employed more than 9,000 people and produced motorcycles that were sold in 42 countries. He was not a celebrity in the way that tech founders had become celebrities. He was something older and more specific, an industry legend, the kind of figure whose name appeared in trade publications and engineering journals rather than lifestyle features, which had suited him fine. He had grown up in a town not entirely unlike Millhaven, in the eastern part of Tennessee, the son of a man who fixed farm equipment for a living. He had learned engines the same way Jack had from the side of someone who already knew them, in a workspace that smelled like oil and metal and the particular damp of old wood. He did not often tell that part of the story in professional settings. Standing in Jack's parking lot in the early morning, he told it. He said it mattered that Jack understand he was not offering charity. He was 63 years old and had a reputation for being demanding, unconventional, and very rarely wrong about mechanical things. He told Jack all of this in the parking lot, standing between the SUVs and the garage, while his team waited at a respectful distance and the crowd on the sidewalk slowly grew. He did not tell it in a self-aggrandizing way. He told it the way someone tells context, the background information required to make the next thing make sense. He explained that once a year, for the past 11 years, he had taken a group of people he trusted on a long motorcycle ride, no itinerary, no staff, minimal communication with the office. He said it kept him honest. The group Jack had met the previous night were his chief of operations, his head of rider safety, his longest-serving production manager, and his personal physician, who was also an old friend. The physician was Ellen, which explained the technical vocabulary. The injury to Raymond's rib was genuine. It was a stress fracture from a minor accident 2 months earlier that was healing but did not appreciate long hours in a saddle. He said all of this plainly, and then stopped, because the context had been provided and now he could say the thing itself. He said he had driven 400 miles across 3 states, specifically because he was looking for someone. Not anyone by name, not Jack specifically, but a kind of someone. He had in his possession a prototype engine, the first functioning version of a new design his engineering team had been developing for 2 years. A design that was intended to be the center of Hale Motor Group's next generation of touring bikes. The prototype had developed a fault that his best engineers had spent 6 weeks trying to diagnose. They had not found it. The engine was sitting in a crate in the back of the third SUV. Raymond said that during the night, watching Jack work, he had seen the fault, he had seen what it was, and he believed, for reasons he would explain later, that Jack could fix what 6 engineers with advanced degrees and 6 weeks of dedicated time could not. He asked if Jack would like to look at it. Jack said yes before Raymond had finished the sentence. They brought the crate inside the garage. Raymond's team set it up with a practiced efficiency that suggested they had done this in unexpected locations before. When the engine came out of the crate, Jack went still in the way he went still when something genuinely interested him, a full-body stillness, all attention directed inward and outward at once. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. Even with the fault, whatever the fault was, it was visibly the product of serious and careful thought, the kind of design that solved old problems in new ways and created new ones in the process, which was the nature of meaningful innovation. Jack walked around it once slowly. He crouched beside it. He asked Raymond 2 questions about the design specifications. Raymond answered both of them with the precision of someone who knew the specifications, the way you know something you've been thinking about for 2 years. Then Jack straightened up and said, "Can I touch it?" Raymond said, "Yes." Jack reached in with both hands. It took him 47 minutes. Raymond stood to one side and watched without speaking. 2 of Raymond's engineers, who had been introduced as Carl and Marcus, both of whom had the careful expressions of people holding their professional pride, with some effort stood on the other side and also watched without speaking, though their silence had a different quality. Jack did not narrate what he was doing, which was his habit. He worked through the engine, systematically, and then, when the system had been covered, he went back to one specific component and stayed there. He asked Marcus for a penlight, which Marcus produced. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "There's a harmonic resonance issue in the secondary balancer shaft. The tolerances are within spec individually, but the interaction between the shaft bearing and the housing produces a vibration at high RPM that propagates into the crankcase and eventually causes microfracturing in the crankcase wall. It's not visible yet, but it's happening. If you run this engine at sustained high RPM for another 100 hours, you'll see it." He looked up. Marcus was staring at him. Carl had gone very still. Raymond looked at Carl and said, "Well?" Carl said slowly. We looked at the secondary balancer. We didn't model the interaction. Raymond nodded once, the nod of someone who had suspected something, and now had confirmation. He looked at Jack. He said, "Can you fix it?" Jack said, "Not today. I'd need to machine a modified bearing housing." But yes, the parking lot crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown, drawn by the SUVs and the unfamiliar faces and the general Millhaven interest in events that were not the usual events. Jack's neighbor from 2 doors down, a retired auto mechanic named Pete, had brought a lawn chair. Jack was not aware of any of this. He was looking at Raymond Hale in the fluorescent light of his garage, oil on his hands, yesterday's clothes, the overdue bills still stacked beside the toolbox, and Raymond was saying, "What if I told you this place could become something much bigger?" Raymond's offer was not a simple thing. He laid it out in his parking lot, sitting on a turned-over milk crate that one of his team produced from somewhere, while Jack leaned against the bay door frame and listened. The offer had 2 parts. The first was a contract role. Jack would join the engineering team at Hale Motor Group as a lead consultant on the new prototype, with a salary that he would name, within reason, and the stipulation that he could work remotely from Millhaven for at least 3 months of the year. The second part of the offer was more conditional. Raymond said he would like to see the garage, not as an investment, not immediately, just see it. Jack said go ahead, it was right there. Raymond said he meant the records, the history of the place, the scope of the work. Jack said that was in the office. Raymond said he would like to see it. Jack said okay. Jack did not say yes. Not that morning. He said he needed to think, which Raymond accepted without pressure. What Jack actually needed was to stand in his garage alone for a few minutes after Raymond's convoy had moved to the parking lot of the Millhaven Diner across the street to wait, and to look at the place that had been his father's and was almost the bank's, and to allow the morning to be real. He called Lily at Clara's house. She said she was fine, asked if it had rained there too, said Clara's mom had made French toast. Jack said that sounded great. He said he would pick her up at noon. He hung up and looked at the toolbox and the overdue bills and the faded blue letters above the bay door. He picked up the stack of bills and held them in both hands, not reading them, just holding them. Then he set them down, put on a clean shirt he kept in the office for situations he'd never quite anticipated, and walked across the street to the diner. He said yes over coffee, which felt like the right setting for it. The transition was not instant. Nothing real was ever instant. Jack drove 4 hours north to Raymond's regional office 3 weeks after the morning in the parking lot to meet the full engineering team, a drive he made in his truck with a thermos of coffee and the public radio station fading in and out through the hills. The team was larger than he expected, 14 engineers across various specializations, and they received him with the range of reactions available to a professional group when someone arrives with the implicit endorsement of the person at the top. Most of them were politely reserved. 2 of them were openly friendly, in a way that suggested genuine interest in what he knew. One of them, a senior engineer named Derek Fowler, who had been with the company for 9 years and carried himself with the careful authority of someone who had invested heavily in his position, looked at Jack with an expression so controlled it communicated exactly what it was, trying not to. Jack found a place in the work quickly, because the work was the kind he was genuinely equipped for. And because when you set aside the professional politics and just look at an engine doesn't care where you're from. He fixed the bearing housing problem in the prototype over the course of a week, working in the company's machine shop with equipment that was a significant improvement over anything in his Millhaven garage. And the first time they ran the modified engine at sustained high RPM and the crankcase remained intact, Carl shook his hand with unmistakable sincerity. Jack spent his evenings in a rented room near the office, calling Lily each night, listening to her tell him about school with the patient happiness of someone who has been worried for a long time and is starting to let it go. He also spent his evenings thinking about the prototype's next design iteration, which was technically beyond his contracted scope, but was impossible not to think about once he understood the design. He wrote his ideas down in a notebook, the same kind of spiral-bound notebook his father had used, and he was careful and specific, sketching force diagrams and component layouts and tolerance specifications in the margins. After the second week, he brought his notebook to a team meeting and laid out a modification to the engine's power delivery system that he thought could improve mid-range torque by a meaningful margin without increasing weight. He explained it clearly and without performance, in the language of the problem and the solution. The room was quiet for a moment. Then, two of the engineers started asking detailed questions, the kind of detailed questions that meant they were taking it seriously. Carl said he wanted to run the numbers. Marcus said he had a thought about the implementation. Derek said nothing. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Jack. His expression was still very controlled. 3 days after that meeting, Jack overheard something he was not meant to hear. He had come back to the engineering workspace after hours to pick up his notebook, which he'd left on the workbench, and two voices were audible from the meeting room down the hall. Derek's and someone else Jack didn't immediately place. The door was mostly closed. He was not eavesdropping. He was walking past, and the voices were not whispering. What he heard was enough. Derek was describing the torque improvement proposal as something the team had been developing independently, something Jack had happened to raise in a way that would need to be clarified in documentation to properly attribute the origin. He used phrases like internal development trajectory and collaborative convergence, which were words that meant something precise in this context, and that precision was a deliberate erasure. The other voice said that seemed manageable. Derek said it was important to handle these. He looked down at the notebook, the pages full of diagrams in his own handwriting, the margins crowded with his own calculations, and then he kept walking. He sat on the edge of the bed in his rented room and thought about this for a long time. He was familiar with this feeling, this specific variety of invisible, where your contribution moves through the world and becomes someone else's by the time it arrives. He had felt it before, in quieter versions. In different rooms in university offices where his ideas were absorbed into group projects without credit, in client conversations where the fix he'd explained was later described since the customer had figured out themselves. He was tired of being familiar with the feeling. He thought about calling Raymond. He thought about calling nobody and saying nothing and going back to Millhaven, which was the option that felt most familiar and cost the most. He thought about Lily. He thought about the overdue bills and the toolbox and the fading blue letters. He opened his notebook and he kept working because the work was real, regardless of what happened to the credit. What saved him from having to make the choice alone was a 24-year-old junior engineer named Sophie, who had been with the company for 8 months and had not yet learned to protect herself by staying quiet. Sophie had been in the meeting room when Derek made his arrangements. She had said nothing then, but the next morning, before the full team assembled, she knocked on the door of Raymond's office and said she had something she needed to tell him, and she told it clearly and completely, including the part where she had said nothing the night before, which she did not try to minimize. Raymond listened to all of it. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Then he thanked her and told her she could go back to work. The full team meeting that morning had the texture of a room where everyone present understood that something was happening, but not exactly what. Raymond came in last, which was unusual. He stood at the head of the table and did not sit down. He said he wanted to discuss the torque proposal and its origins. And he said it in the voice that people who had worked for him for years described as the voice that meant, what follows this is not a discussion but an informing. He described the content of the proposal accurately and attributed it to Jack Turner, consulting engineer, and then he said that documentation to this effect would be corrected where it had been incorrectly prepared. He did not name Derek. He looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. Raymond then turned to Jack, who was sitting near the window, still in yesterday's notebook-marked silence, and said, "From today forward, Jack Turner leads this project." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the structure has shifted and everyone is recalibrating. Jack led the project. He was not performative about it. He didn't give a speech or rearrange the room or demand acknowledgement. He opened his notebook, turned to the current page, and said, Here's where I think we need to focus for the next 3 weeks. And they got to work. Derek transferred off the project 4 days later, citing a need to focus on a different initiative, which everyone understood and nobody said aloud. The engineers, who had been genuinely curious from the start, and there were more of them than the first meeting had suggested, found working with Jack to be straightforwardly productive, which is the thing that engineers value most when they are being honest about it. Carl said once, after a long session that resulted in a solution nobody had seen coming, that Jack thought about engines the way most people thought about people, like they had feelings and preferences and limits that mattered. Jack said he'd grown up around engines before he'd grown up around people, so that might be exactly right. The prototype completed its final testing cycle in the spring. The result exceeded the performance targets in 4 of 6 categories and met them in the other 2, which was better than anyone had projected at the start of the project, and significantly better than anyone had projected after the first crankcase failure. Raymond flew in for the final test run and stood at the edge of the track in a jacket that was not a suit, the closest he got to casual, and watched the bike go around with an expression that Jack, watching from beside the timing equipment, recognized as the face of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is in the process of getting it. The motorcycle press coverage began 6 weeks later, when Hale Motor Group announced the new line at an industry event in Chicago. The coverage was not small. The prototype's performance numbers were unusual enough to generate genuine attention, not the breathless enthusiasm of lifestyle riding, but the careful interest of people who understood what the numbers meant and were recalibrating their assumptions. The engine's mid-range torque profile was described by one publication as genuinely novel, which in engineering journalism is a phrase reserved for things that actually are. 3 of the larger trade publications ran features. 2 of them mentioned Jack Turner by name, the consulting engineer from Millhaven, Kentucky, and told the garage story, the rain, the bikers, the overnight repair, the early morning convoy, with varying degrees of detail but consistent accuracy, because Raymond had made the story available deliberately. He thought the story mattered. He thought it was the kind of story that told you something true about how things actually worked, as opposed to how they were supposed to work. One journalist called Jack directly for a quote. Jack said he was glad the engine was running well. The journalist said she meant something more personal than that, and Jack said, "That's the most personal thing I know how to say about something I worked on." She used it because it was exactly right. Millhaven received this information, the way small towns receive information about their own, with a pride that was disproportionate to the actual involvement of the town, and completely genuine for exactly that reason. Mrs. Patterson called Jack to say she'd seen his name in the paper. Pete, from 2 doors down, hung a printed-out article on his own garage door, which Jack only discovered because someone told him, and he drove by to look, and he sat in his truck for a moment, looking at his own name in newsprint taped to a neighbor's door, and felt something he couldn't quite name, which was something like being seen. The high school invited him to talk to the shop class, which he did, bringing a disassembled carburetor and a patience for questions that surprised the teacher. Lily came to that one and sat in the back row, and did not say she was proud, but had an expression that covered the same ground. The garage was renovated. Raymond arranged it, though he was careful about how he arranged it, not as charity, which Jack would not have accepted, but as a business arrangement with terms they negotiated for 2 weeks by phone until both of them were satisfied. New equipment, a new lift, repainted walls, the blue letters above the bay door redone in fresh paint by a sign painter from 3 towns over who matched the original color from a photo Jack had of his father in front of the garage in 1986. The bank loan was resolved. Jack paid it off, which was the specific version of resolution he required. The overdue bills disappeared from beside the toolbox. New bills came, and were paid on time, and that particular weight lifted. Raymond also proposed something else. He had been thinking about it since the morning in the parking lot, he said, since watching Jack work through the night for people he didn't know and had no reason to help. He wanted to fund a training program, a real one, structured and long-term for young mechanics from small towns and underserved communities, attached to the garage, and eventually to a slightly larger facility nearby. The program would carry Jack's name which Jack resisted for approximately 2 months before understanding that the name was not for him but for the people it might bring in, the young people who might need to see a name they recognized from a place that looked like their place before they believed the program was meant for them. He agreed. The facility broke ground in early autumn. He taught the first cohort himself, 8 young people, ranging from 17 to 23, most of them from within 50 miles of Millhaven, most of them from circumstances that had not provided a great deal of room for error. He taught them the way his father had taught him, by doing the work beside them, by explaining the thinking, not just the steps, by treating an engine as something worth understanding rather than something to get through. He told them early on that there was no such thing as a stupid question about a machine, because machines were honest in ways that people sometimes weren't. They broke for reasons, and the reasons were always findable if you were patient enough. He told them that patience was not a passive quality. He told them that stubbornness and patience looked identical from the outside and were completely different on the inside. He told them to keep notebooks. All 8 of them kept notebooks. He kept his own old toolbox at the back of the teaching bay, the same one that had sat beside the overdue bills on the night of the rain, dented and stickered and full of tools with worn handles, because he thought it was important that it was visible, that it told its own part of the story, without needing to be explained. Sometimes a student would ask about it, and he would say it was the first toolbox he'd ever owned, which was true, and that it still worked, which was also true. That was usually enough. A journalist from a regional magazine came to write about the program in its second month. She was young and serious, and asked good questions about the curriculum, about the students, about the partnership with Hale Motor Group, about what it took to build something like this in a place like Millhaven. She took notes in a physical notebook with a pen, which Jack noticed and appreciated without mentioning. She spoke to 2 of the students, who were both in the middle of disassembling a late-model cruiser engine, and who answered her questions without looking up from the work, which she wrote down as though it were a detail worth keeping. At the end of the interview, after she'd covered everything she'd come to cover, she asked one more. She asked what had changed his life on that night. That specific night. The rain, the strangers, all of it. What was it, really? Jack was standing near the open bay door. It was evening, and outside the sky was doing something complicated with the light, the clouds from an incoming system picking up the last of the sun in shades of orange and gray. It looked a little like it might rain. He looked at it for a while before he answered. Then he said, "I fixed their bikes. They fixed my faith in people." The journalist wrote it down. She looked up. She said, "That's it?" Jack said, "That's everything." She wrote that down too. And when the piece ran 3 weeks later, that exchange was the last line, which was the correct editorial decision. The sign above the new facility came on for the first time at dawn on a Thursday in late October. Almost exactly 1 year from the night of the rain. Raymond was there, and Carl, and Sophie, who had been promoted twice since the morning she knocked on Raymond's door, and Pete from next door with his lawn chair, and Mrs. Patterson, who had brought a thermos of actual good coffee, and 8 young mechanics who had started as strangers and were becoming something else, and Lily, who stood beside her father and watched the letters light up one by one in the early gray light. Turner Technical Institute. The paint bright and clean and the letters evenly spaced, the way her grandfather would have done it. She said, quietly enough that only her father could hear. Grandpa would have liked this. Jack put his arm around her shoulders. He thought about the night of the rain, the headlights through the storm, the 5 people standing at the edge of the parking lot in the dark. He thought about how small the decision to open the door had felt in the moment, and what it had grown into, and how the 2 things were connected by something he couldn't fully name but recognized as real. The first light of morning came over the eastern hill, thin and new, and fell across the painted letters and the wet parking lot and the face of the man who had fixed engines in the dark for years and had finally, in the right season, been seen.